Good morning. This is Pat O'Connell. I'm calling to order a special open meeting where we've got California ISO representatives here this morning. And the idea and the goal behind this meeting is just to have a conversation to learn what's going on in California around regional markets. And so the value of having that conversation in this format is then we can ask questions, and I have new questions that occur because of the questions my fellow commissioners ask. Hopefully we'll have an even better conversation than we would have otherwise. So I have a fairly cozy group here in the room, but I can see there's a few people that have logged into the Zoom channel. So go ahead and I'll do a roll call vote and consideration and approval of the agenda, and then turn the floor over to Stacy, Milos, and Holly, and they'll go through the presentation. And then I think we'll have some time for questions and answers as we move along. So roll call vote, Commissioner Aguilera.
Present.
Commissioner Ellison.
Present.
Commissioner O'Connell, present. So consideration of the agenda, we have one item, which is the presentation. And like I say, I think we'll have time and room after the presentation for some good discussion and questions and answers. Commissioners, do you have any changes you want to make to that agenda?
None for me.
Okay, so seeing no disagreement, the agenda is approved. So I'm going to turn this over to Stacy Crowley, Vice President of External Affairs from the California ISO. With her at the table right now is Milos Bosanic, a manager from Regional Markets Sector, California ISO. And apologize if I butchered your name. And then also with us from California ISO is Holly Taylor, the manager of External Affairs. So take it away, Stacy.
Thank you, Chairman, and good morning, Commissioners. We're happy to be here and have a cozy discussion about a little bit about the California ISO and the questions you have about some of the activities that we're working on and that are just generally of interest in the West. So thank you for providing the time, and look forward to getting your questions and just finding out what's of interest to you all. But at first we thought we can go to I guess it's slide 2, just the agenda. Briefly, we wanted to walk through just an overview of the ISO. I think. Okay. Thank you. Yes.
I don't know who's doing that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So the next slide, please. Slide 2. Okay, great. So again, we just wanted to provide a quick overview of the California Independent System Operator. You may know it, but for maybe those on the phone, just a brief overview of what we do in our scope of work. We'll touch a little bit on the Western Energy Imbalance Market, and then move into the extended day-ahead market, where Milos will take over. And then we'll talk just a little bit about our stakeholder processes, how we work as a public benefit corporation in the open meetings and things like that, as well as current activity at the California legislature, which might be of interest to you all regarding expanded regional cooperation in the West. And then a couple of more technical items on resource adequacy and transmission planning. So a lot to cover, but hopefully, and happy to answer questions along the way if you have them. Sure. So next slide, please. Slide 3. So this is just a map indicating how we fit into the sort of national picture. We are one of 9 independent system operators, otherwise known as regional transmission organizations. There's sort of 2 terms that mean basically the same thing. And we're one of 9. And the way we have the shading on the West, you'll see that sort of the bold orange is the California ISO's footprint. That is 80% of California and a small portion of Nevada. And the lighter shade orange is those that are participating, the kind of footprint of those participating in our Western Energy Imbalance Market. So it is a part of our market, but they're not a part of our balancing authority area. So as I said, we are a nonprofit, a public benefit corporation, a 501c3. We get our funding from the customers directly. So no state funds, but all through the customers that we serve, which are mainly load serving entities in the state of California, as well as that small portion of Nevada. We are one of within the Western Interconnection, which is that sort of heavy blue line that goes north to south from Canada down to Mexico. West of that, it's the Western Electric Coordinating Council region. They manage the reliability standards for the western part of the United States. And within that footprint, we are one of 39 balancing authority areas. And what that means is that each of those 39 areas has to maintain supply and demand at 60 hertz to make sure the transmission is running smoothly. So we each have that responsibility within our footprint. And there are 39 in the Western US, which makes it challenging sometimes. So the next slide, please. Slide 4. Great. This the bottom is just a kind of an image of our control center, which we would love to provide a tour anytime you're out in the Sacramento area. It's a neat facility, and you really see what it is our operators do every day. And we are responsible for the reliable operation of the high voltage transmission system. And we run the energy market to provide that efficient dispatch of the energy. So that's our core mission, is to do that reliably and cost effectively for our consumers. We do that through a non-discriminatory access to our transmission system. And with that, we have open interconnection processes and transmission planning processes to make sure that all happens. And then, as I said, we do operate the wholesale electric market. And this really was the first market in the West. We provided that to the customers that we have, which includes folks like Pacific Gas and Electric, Southern California Edison. We have a number of small municipal utilities in California that essentially turn over the control of their transmission assets and their resources to us through the market.
I did have a quick question on there.
Yeah.
Could you just briefly talk about how the ISO's functions compare or work with CPUC and the CEC?
Right. So that's a good question. And we work very closely with the state agencies with regards to the planning function that we have. So we utilize the California Public Utilities Commission forecast for resources they intend to procure to meet the load of the customers in California. The CPUC base that on the California Energy Commission's demand forecast. So the Energy Commission develops the demand forecast. They provide that to the California Public Utilities Commission, and that then turns into sort of a resource plan through what is traditionally known as a IRP, the Integrated Resource Plan. And then we get that information as the ISO, and we look at how the transmission system needs to be upgraded or added to meet the needs of what the state plans to procure. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. And we'll touch on some of this a bit later as well, but there's also a function in informing the resource adequacy and managing the resource adequacy plans for their jurisdictional utilities and how much procurement they do on an annual and a monthly basis. So it's both informing the transmission planning process and also the resource procurement process.
Just one other question on that. So the utilities such as PG&E or Southern California Edison would undergo an IRP process. Is that correct? And that they would, I guess, present what resources they feel are needed, and that process goes forward with the CPUC. But it seems like there would have to be some linkage with the transmission, that they couldn't just say, they wouldn't automatically know where to place resources or which resources would be the cheapest unless there's some iteration they go through with the transmission. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah. So the CPUC manages the integrated resource planning process and identifies what are those resources, working in collaboration with the utilities, what are those resources needs, flexible resource types of resources needed across a long-term horizon, 10-year horizon to meet the state's electrification goals and grid modernization goals and decarbonization goals. What are those resource needs across that 10-year horizon? And we have input into that as well. How do you do that while also maintaining reliability? And what's that appropriate resource mix? That information then feeds into the transmission planning process that we'll touch a little bit later. And we're providing signals then through that transmission planning process. What are the zones across the system where you would want to site resources? Where do we have transmission capacity? Where to interconnect those resources? And where are we going to create additional builds to integrate those resources? And that drives then development and provides incentives to develop resources and to connect them in those areas where there's capacity on the system.
So it's a lot of back and forth, I think, just making sure that we are coordinating and using that information, using the same information throughout the process. So, yep. Okay. And finally, on this slide, just to note, I did mention that we do operate the Western Energy Imbalance Market for about 80% of the load in the West. And I'll talk about that a little bit more. And we also serve as the reliability coordinator, which is a formal term that NERC, the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, sort of establishes to make sure that there's this sort of overarching view of the reliability in any particular area. We perform the reliability coordination services for a little over 80% of the West. Southwest Power Pool does provide the RC, the reliability coordination services, for another portion of the West. So that's, again, it's just this sort of high altitude view of how all of the balancing authority areas are meeting their reliability standards across that footprint. And we have a sort of a separate function of our operators. Next slide, please. So the Western Energy Imbalance Market, I know you've heard about this. Public Service New Mexico and El Paso Electric are participants in that market. El Paso just joined us on April 5th. We're happy to have them as part of the market. And what that is it's the real-time market that we utilize to optimize dispatch in the real time. And what this allows utilities to do who participate is offer in those last 5 minutes, if there are pluses and minuses in what they expected to see in their load, they can sort of bid into the marketing and really use the lowest cost energy to meet that demand if they find that they need that demand in that real-time market. And it is just a small portion of the market. We have the day-ahead market, which Milos will talk about later, but it's really proven well to just optimize that last bit of energy that has otherwise just been really sat idle or not as effectively utilized without the market to provide that geographic diversity and the resource diversity across the larger footprint. So right now we're operating that market in 11 states in the West. There are 22 entities, and those that are joint are balancing authority areas. Remember, I mentioned there's 39 in the West. So the balancing authority itself joins the market, and then resources or load serving entities within that can also participate. It does operate about 80% of the load in the West.
Because I got two kind of wonky questions on that. The first is, we talk a lot about grid modernization, but what do each utility have to do to make that work? Is there communication between a central location in California, and how are they connected together? You're talking about 5 minutes, so there's not a lot of time for thinking, right? So.
It is telemetry, we call it telemetry, and the units need to have that sort of real-time, the ability to dispatch in that 5 minute. And so there is some, for utilities that may not have that already, there is some work to be able to participate in the Western Energy Imbalance Market through upgrades in their software systems and their technology systems at the resource level. So that is factored into their sort of initial costs, and then in most cases, the utilities have seen those costs be reimbursed within 2 years. So that, and then now those utilities also need to have operators managing that. So typically, utilities that aren't in the market don't have 24-hour desks. And so they do have to have now a real-time set of operators that is facilitating that dispatch of energy in real time and sending the signals to our market software programs to say, okay, we would like to purchase the energy now. It does add some staffing resources to each utility.
Yeah, and if I can add, as an entity joins, there's a lot of modeling that goes on because different resources and transmission facilities. So through that modeling process is where we model those resources that are capable of performing in such a way and responding quickly to our signals when we dispatch a resource. And then we also have non-participating resources, which are resources that don't necessarily have that capability. And just indicate to the market ahead of time how they plan to run. But there's a lot of modeling that goes on, and our market is able to also reflect in that modeling different limitations of those resources the market respects, so that when we issue a dispatch instruction, we know that it's an instruction that the resource is capable of performing, because we know all the capabilities of the resource, limitations, and any other characteristics.
Well, then that led to my next question is, what are the other 20% doing? Because I mean, this whole thing is this big coordinated dance of resources and loads. And so if the other 20% aren't in sync with the 80% that's being handled by imbalance, how does that work? Do they just kind of automatically follow, or?
Yeah, so the rest of the footprint that's not in the EIM, they continue to do things much as they do today and much as they did before the EIM. It's more of a manual, bilateral arrangement process where they are, in the day-ahead time frame, in the real-time time frame, ensuring that they have enough resources under contract, and then they're scheduling and dispatching them. And then they have to manage on their own to the extent that there are any deviations. They have reserves that they procure to the extent that there are changes. But it's, in our experience, it's more inefficient and it's a bit more costly. And that's why you've seen some of the benefits of the EIM, of being able to leverage the resources across a larger footprint, ensure that least cost dispatch to meet those needs. Otherwise, entities are working on their own and just bilaterally contracting, which may not be necessarily the best deal.
Or available.
Yeah, may not be available.
Yeah, I mean, it was kind of a seems question. That was a word that got overused in Nevada last week. But I mean, does that cause like frequency issues? The fact that some 80% is under coordination and cooperation, but 20% isn't.
So each in both the EIM, and then I'll talk about the EDAM later as well, but each balancing area continues to retain their own reliability management function. So they're all responsible to while the market is going to be dispatching resources, they're all still responsible for managing reliability within their own balancing area, ensuring compliance with different standards, ensuring frequency management. And so they're continuing to coordinate with neighboring balancing areas to the extent that things do, go out of different levels or go out of whack, for lack of a better term. So there's that continued operational coordination with all the neighboring balancing areas. The market is performing the function of, we're not taking necessarily that balancing area management function, but the market is dispatching those resources. And then we're aware of conditions and we operations with the ISO and different balancing area continues to communicate to the extent that there are some deviations in frequency, then each balancing area is responsible for solving that. Whether that means bringing in additional supply that you may have in your balancing area, whether that means taking other actions or coordinating with your neighboring BA.
Thank you.
So, sorry, I just
Yeah.
had a reminder. Thank you. I guess just to follow up a little bit, if we were to think about the Western Interconnect before EIM, so your balancing authorities had to do bilateral contracts if they wanted to have some power purchases sort of on the spot. So they would have to enter into some agreement And then they would have to schedule the transmission, correct? And wouldn't they have to schedule it an hour in advance? Or I guess I'm wondering how does the mechanism work without the EIM? Is it an hour in advance scheduling of the transmission line?
Yeah, without the EIM, before the EIM, what used to occur is, you're right, entities would enter into bilateral arrangements of supply, and then they would have to buy transmission under the open access tariff and then schedule it. I think usually you have up till 20 minutes before flow to submit all of your schedules and those E-tags. So they had to then go out and buy the resource, they had to buy the transmission, depending on the quality of transmission they wanted, and then scheduling that across the different systems or internal to that system. With the EIM, they still need to some extent, to the extent they're non-participating resources, or not flexible, or they're not participating for one or other reason, they still have to enter into those bilateral arrangements and schedule that transmission, let the market know in advance that they're planning on utilizing that resource. But otherwise, other resources that are participating are bidding into the market, and the market then is optimizing what's called residual transmission that may not be utilized, that each balancing area transmission provider makes available. The market is optimizing that then to support these real-time transfers between resources and identify the cheapest resource across the footprint that would be able to serve that demand.
And so with the EIM, you could say, I'm 5 minutes from now, I see that I'm going to have a lot of solar, and so I'm offering solar for the next hour at this price. So you could do it, just 5 minutes ahead, or
that's right. There's different time frames. You can submit bids before you move into the real-time market. There's resource efficiency tests that we run, where each entity, each balancing area, has to demonstrate that I have sufficient resources bid into the market to meet my next hour expected conditions. And we run those tests kind of on an hourly basis. And then resources are bid into the market in those 5 and 15-minute increments. They have different flexibilities of bidding at different levels depending on the output that they're expecting, and solar resources depending on their forecast. But yes, they can bid that into the market, and then the market is going to look to find the least cost solution for meeting those imbalances and those differences in load across the entire footprint. And the solar resource may get a dispatch instruction to be at a particular level by a certain time.
So before the energy imbalance market, you were sort of stuck with that hourly chunk of resource, whatever you had sort of planned for
the whole hour,
for that hour.
right?
You've
got to nominate, I guess, if you wanted to sell somebody power or buy power, you had to say, in the next, like if it's 9 o'clock now, you had to say from 11 to 12, I'm going to buy 100 megawatts from whoever.
Resource X. Yep. And that
Right.
would be what you had. You didn't recognize any value if there was a cheaper resource that could fulfill that same need within the market. There's now more visibility and access to those, maybe the lower cost resource to get you what you need in that hour. Otherwise you didn't have that.
And would you say it's really the adoption of higher and higher levels of variable generation that really, the EIM really makes sense when you have high levels of variable generation?
That's exactly right. And it really came up, the conversation started to occur when we saw renewable energy portfolio standards being developed around the West to say, okay, there will be an increase in variable resources. We understand that. How do we recognize that and maybe capture some of that geographic diversity value? And so in fact, utility commissioners from around the West asked that question of grid operators, and they put out basically a request for information on how we could solve that variability challenge. And so out of that group, we put a proposal in for this real-time market, and off it went. But it was really utility commissioners who saw that writing on the wall to say, okay, our states have developed policies for these clean energy, which is inherently variable, wind and solar in particular, not geothermal, of course. But so how do we handle that? So it was really to solve that solve that problem as efficiently as possible, recognizing that geographic diversity can play a big role.
Yeah, and just to illustrate for you, just a simple example of, in the middle of the day when maybe California has excess renewable resources, those resources can be dispatched and committed to serve load in other areas more cost efficiently. And then in the late afternoons, we're importing resources from other areas, more flexible supply as our solar resources are ramping down and our load is increasing. We need flexible resources, and often we depend upon imports to be able to fill that gap from other areas of the West.
Yeah. And the next slide, please. That really shows we're trying to figure out how to best graphically show the transfers that are happening within that market. And it's a very pretty slide. Yeah, exactly. The pastels, but it just shows the variety of transfers. On the left is where power is coming from. And those are very small abbreviations of the utilities that are involved in the EIM and where they're going to. And it's just a basic diagram to show that it is being utilized. Really, there is value because of the geographic diversity across the West. And so really, and if you look at PNM, for example, they are providing resources up, westward and north as well. So it's kind of interesting graphic, but the energy imbalance market has gone quite well. We do quarterly benefits reports, really to just sort of make sure that we're sort of tracking the progress, and we're tracking the amount of transfers. And as of the end of last year, we saw about $3.4 billion in benefits across the members. And we just specifically laid out what PNM has seen since they joined in 2021. They've received about 47 million in what we call gross benefits. So that doesn't account for the additional costs that they have to have that market, the desk that I mentioned and some other things. But I think it's worked out very well for every participant so far. What it's also done is really, I think, connected the utilities in a way that has never been done before. They really are learning from each other, best practices on how to best optimize their set of resources and really sort of make this market the best that it can be. And so just the relationships and the conversations happening across the West have really gotten deeper, and I think have really gone a long way to find out, just the differences, really, frankly, in how folks have run their energy resources in the past. So I think that's been a big benefit too.
Yeah. This diagram here is excellent. I think it really does show how sharing resources and, when you have excess capacity or when you need it, really helps optimize the use of the resources. I think a result from this is having to acquire overall fewer resources, which will reduce the cost to ratepayers eventually. I also really like this because it shows which utilities or balancing authority areas rather are importers or exporters overall. For PNM, for example, I'm looking here that they are exporting, just judging by the size of the little piece they have on this bar. And so I guess one question I have is how do you measure this? Is it like the e-tags or like where they're going?
Right. We developed a methodology to we track the transfers through the dispatch. And so we do know who's bid in and then which bids have been accepted. So we do that through the sort of tagging, as you say. We measure the benefits based on the sort of counterfactual, what would have happened without the market. And so that's how we get the gross benefit savings. But in terms of the transfers, we track that, I think, every 5 minutes, right? And it's a lot of data. And our quarterly reports do summarize the transfers more in a kind of a spreadsheet format, which you could sort of start to see how PNM, for example, is utilizing their resources. Are they a bigger exporter than an importer? And maybe certain times of the day is, the wind here in the afternoon is very helpful. Yes, we do calculate that all. And the quarterly benefits reports are sort of a summarized version, but I think there's a lot of data behind that information to back that up.
Yeah, and we usually work as well with we preview some of the assessments and with different utilities prior to publishing the results to validate this. And some of the utilities may do their own benefits assessments as well.
Mhm.
But
One question, I know the two of the utilities here in New Mexico, PNM and El Paso, are adding utility scale solar at a pretty rapid clip, and for PNM at least, you're going to see, within a year or two, I think, a quite large increase in what they're doing, and I would guess that our neighbors are doing similar things, so that everybody is going to have a lot of solar during the day, and that there are going to be curtailment issues. Do you see enough transmission capacity in the Western Interconnect to get that solar to places further north that might need it?
It's a good question. And I know we'll talk a little bit about the transmission planning process, but because there is an interregional planning process within the West that is meant to really, I think, address that exact issue. So each region has a planning region, a transmission planning region, and they sort of then take that clump of transmission plans and resources and compares it to their neighbors, right? The ISO is its own planning region, and then we've got the West Connect, which I think PNM is part of, and then there's a Northern Grid group. So I think that's really meant to, and they do try to look long term, right, 10 years out, and so to try to address exactly that question about at some point, how can we capture the benefits of those geographically diverse resources like solar in the Southwest and hydro and wind in the Northwest, and capture those and make sure that there is enough capability on the transmission line to get those through. The way, at least as it sits today, the energy imbalance market uses sort of the existing transmission contracts, as Milos said, and at the moment it's working pretty well. There might be we might see some congestion in areas, but it seems to be working pretty well. And of course, during extreme conditions, as we saw even last summer, when much of the West was in a long heat wave, those conditions get stressed, right? The straws get full to move the energy back and forth.
Can prices go negative on the EIM?
They can, in some cases, because of the tax credit. I think it's really aligned around the tax credits that were available for some solar and wind resources. Using that energy, no matter what the cost, is better than not using it at all. So there can be some negative costs on occasion, which is a good deal for those who are getting that energy.
yeah, and I'll note as well on the transmission question that we'll touch later on what California is doing about proactively looking at transmission plans to be able to achieve some of the decarbonization goals. But in the EIM and the EDAM context that I'll talk about next, each, again, balancing area transmission provider continues to on their own plan their transmission system and retain that function. But that's really one of the benefits of a regional transmission organization, is that broader authority and broader outlook across that wider footprint, and be able to then more holistically look at what are the transmission projects that would be needed to facilitate meeting the needs of the wider footprint. So at this moment in the EIM and in the EDAM, each entity continues to plan on their own, and to the extent that they're leveraging some of the interregional transmission processes. But I think the hope down for the future is that RTO function, where it can more effectively then take on that transmission need evaluation across that wider footprint. So that's where I think some additional coordination the EIM and the EDAM is still needed on the transmission side between different balancing area that occurs outside of the market. But as Stacy's noted, we're seeing still the transmission that is made available, and to the extent that they do build some additional projects, there's ability for additional transmission then to be optimized in the real-time market and the day-ahead market, even absent an RTO.
And then to the point about the curtailments, I also just wanted to mention sort of the benefit of having a peak load at different times in real time at different times of the day, right? So, when there's a lot more solar in California, here in New Mexico, it's, getting darker and people are coming home. So we're not generating as much solar, but we are consuming. And so there are benefits there as well.
That's exactly right. That's exactly on a daily basis, as well as on a seasonal basis as well. The winter peaking areas and summer peaking areas, really, that's where the market can really provide that benefit of decreasing the need for curtailments and being able to export that renewable generation in the middle of the day, and then rely on other areas as well to bring in additional generation in the evening areas.
We do, just anecdotally, last summer, September 6th, 2022 was a very stressful day on the grid. And our operators know that without the energy imbalance market, there would have been like rolling blackouts, just having that access, because fortunately, the Pacific Northwest wasn't having that extreme heat. They had that extreme heat in June. If you recall, they were in the upper 100s. But for that day when the Southwest was, I think, pretty stressed, we were able to import some of that, the hydro and the Northwest wind. So the energy imbalance market has really helped with reliability. And Milos will turn to the extended day ahead market now. And we know that would even better enhance the reliability conditions at the stressed conditions.
It's not really intended to be a reliability market,
Exactly.
is it? The EIM, it just sort of saved the day.
It did. And it's really an economic platform, a software platform, but it has been proven to really help with reliability.
That's right. When it was what may be very high heat conditions in California, maybe normal conditions, a little bit more normal conditions in Arizona, and for example, they helped a lot with some of the exports in other areas of the West. And then another illustrative example of, I think, the reliability benefit that the EIM provides, intended or not, but is during those periods as well. In Idaho, for example, there was a loss of a sizable resource, but the EIM was able to find efficient and effective imports of 200 to 300 megawatts to be able to back up that loss of generation during that same period of that week of the heat wave.
There's lots of examples. There was a pretty significant fire that was affecting one of the major straws from the Northwest down to California, the COI, California Oregon intertie. And it basically reduced the amount of energy that could go along those lines. And so the energy imbalance market really helped find alternate ways to get that power across. So all these conditions, we're finding these wildfire issues, the extreme heat, these heat domes that are, we're testing the system, right? And we're finding that the more collaboration, the more ability to access geographically diverse resources, the better.
One other question on the EIM. Without the EIM, to do a bilateral contract, you'd have to pay for transmission on whatever path the transmission happened on. But with EIM, it's sort of all included. Is that right? There's no separate transmission fees, or you're not looking at the path or any of that. Is that correct?
Right. We do need to know that there is a path, but what the EIM entities do is essentially give up any additional usage of their transmission of their contracts to the energy imbalance market. So it's sort of an agreement that all entities make for no charge. And so if there is available transmission, it gets used in that real time.
Yeah, and the other key piece is that when you lose generation, let's just use the example in real time, it may be difficult to quickly find other resources or contract in real time when that resource is lost. And so that's where the EIM as well, those 5 and 15-minute increments, you've got bids already in the market that you can dispatch quickly, and whereas bilaterally, the entity would be likely trying to scramble to find that generation, enter into a contract. How much do I need? The market is able to quickly respond and dispatch that resource.
So why don't we move on to the day-ahead market? Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, if we can move to the next slide 7, just to talk a little bit about the extended day-ahead market. And I think the success of the EIM and the collaboration that's been developed since 2014 has really spurred an interest in expanding the market by a number of entities. I think a number of entities have come to us and said, let's look at what would it take to stand up a day-ahead market. And that's where we've embarked on an initiative over the last year to look at the different components and design of a Western day-ahead market. And so what the day-ahead market is, it's really an extension now of our day-ahead market function and being able to economically commit and position resources now from a day-ahead perspective ahead of time to meet the expected needs that are forecasted load and other conditions that we're expecting the day-ahead time frame. And so more efficiently commit those resources in day-ahead. And what that has the effect as well as doing is then you have less activity or less need and less management in the real time, but you position the footprint as much as you can in day-ahead time frame so that the real time you're really dealing again with some of those imbalances. But it builds on the EIM proven economic reliability and environmental benefits that I'll touch on a bit later. A key tenet that's currently in the EIM and continues and it's retained in the EDAM is that the EDAM just extends the day-ahead market. The ISO as the market operator does not take on certain key responsibilities, and those responsibilities remain with each of the balancing areas that are participating. The resource planning function, how those entities are managing their long-term resource procurement, whether through a formal resource adequacy program or another resource planning program. Their transmission planning function, they continue to retain that role under their open access transmission tariff for managing and expanding their grid to meet their needs. And then they also retain the reliability operator function. They continue to be responsible for managing the day-to-day and hour-to-hour reliability within their balancing area, compliance with NERC standards to ensure, avoiding frequency deviations and continuing to overall manage reliability within their own footprint. We'll talk a bit later, but that's if you move to an RTO, that's where now the RTO takes on that function of a broader reliability coordinator and reliability operator for the footprint. They take on the transmission planning function. And then also you would have a common resource planning or resource adequacy program across that larger footprint.
Can you
Yeah.
Can you talk about what market power mitigation there is available in the EDAM?
Yeah. I mean, we would in the EDAM as we proposed it, we would extend the current market power mitigation features that exist in the real-time market and in the EIM. But effectively, you're looking at what are the bids of the resources, what are the transmission conditions on the grid, and looking at is there a potential there for exertion of market power, and the market then, if it identifies that potential, then each resource already has bids that are in the market, kind of default energy bids, and their bids may be mitigated down to those default energy bids. But we're looking to extend the current market power mitigation that's been in operation since 2014 in the EIM to the EDAM. And we have a concurrent initiative that's looking more broadly at is there any need for evolution in the market power mitigation framework? But that's a little bit of a longer term initiative that's looking at the ISO market, real-time market, day-ahead market. Throughout our design on EDAM, stakeholders supported starting the EDAM more simply. Let's extend what's currently in place and let's work together to evaluate, is there an evolution needed in that market power mitigation framework? So if we move on to the next slide 8, just to touch a bit on the day-ahead market benefits and harnessing benefits of that day-ahead market in the West. But I think we've spent a little bit of time talking about the economic benefits. We've talked about the economic benefits in the EIM. And there will be continue to be economic benefits of now optimizing unit commitment in the day ahead time frame. In the real time today, there's a lot of resources that are participating. Those are flexible resources that, as Stacy noted, can respond to dispatch instructions. But not all resources are necessarily participating in the day ahead, in the real time market. You have resources that need significant or sizable startup times. And those are usually your more flexible resources as well in certain instances, but they need indication multiple hours in advance, if not, potentially a day in advance, to be able to start up operation. And those resources now would also be able to participate in the market in the day ahead time frame, where they can receive optimized commitments and where they're expected to be or what levels in real time, and then they can respond to those. But those are the economic benefits of optimized unit commitment in the day ahead time frame, more cost effectively across the entire footprint, and the savings that provides of that least cost dispatch in day ahead and in real time. Then there is reliability benefits, increased reliability benefits to what we already talked about, the EIM, but it's reduced operational risk that we see from our perspective, in that you now have visibility across the wider footprint in the day ahead time frame of what the conditions are, what's the availability of transmission, what's the availability of supply in the day ahead time frame, such that you have confidence that there is enough resources to be able to manage conditions that may change in real time. And I'll just use the September heat wave as an example. If you had the EDAM in that time frame, you would have visibility in the day ahead time frame as to the availability of supply and excess supply in that day ahead time frame, so that you could position that supply in day ahead to meet conditions, and you would have also the confidence that you have excess supply to be able to dispatch in real time, so that you potentially avoid the need to declare system emergencies for each individual balancing area. Because usually when a balancing area, and I'll speak from the California ISO perspective, but when we declare an emergency, different levels of emergencies, it provides access to different additional supply that may not have otherwise been available, additional demand response programs, additional strategic position emergency resources. But a declaration of an emergency also increases prices as well. And so if you know in the day ahead time frame what the conditions of supply conditions are, you have more confidence going into real time and in those heat waves, that you can solve those conditions and you can manage the grid and the footprint reliably without individual balancing areas having to declare emergency conditions to access additional supply. So it overall reduces that operational risk and provides access to more diverse and flexible resources across the footprint in the day ahead time frame.
And I would just note that visibility, and you mentioned this, but it's important that it would reduce those real scarcity pricing, the high prices that we saw because of that. You didn't have that visibility. So we think that would help that as well.
Can I just try to summarize how I think of EDAM, and you can tell me if I'm overestimating or underestimating it. What I heard is allows you to be more strategic than EIM because you're looking a day ahead. And then you're unlocking a bigger bucket of dollars that will benefit from efficiency. And so, I mean, that's the way I think about it, is it's a step improvement on EIM, but is that fair?
That's right.
Yeah. And then the item that again, it's not necessarily quantifiable, but it's that reliability component, is that improved reliability, situational awareness and day ahead, that, as Stacy said, it can avoid some of those scarcity pricing conditions, avoid or mitigate the need for emergency conditions in individual balancing areas, depending on what they're facing, because you have that confidence in day ahead that you have supply to manage those changes in conditions.
It wouldn't really help with a forced outage, but it allows you to deal with the day ahead weather forecast or those.
And even in some instances, to the extent that you do have a forced outage that materializes in real time, you have confidence that there is supply, because you know what the supply conditions are across the West, to be able to mitigate or manage that loss of supply, that you can dispatch resources elsewhere to be able to respond to those conditions. Whereas today in the EIM only, in those instances, I'll use the Idaho example where you've had a forced outage of a resource. there happened to be enough supply in real time, and you're kind of scrambling in real time to see is there supply. But you would have had, if in the EDAM, you would have had some broader situational awareness in day ahead. Do I have supply to be able to absorb certain losses of generation,
Or a unit that would need to be started up
Yeah.
to work in the next day. Sometimes there's long ramping requirements for certain resources. So knowing that they had, and that could be a resource that through the EDAM could be accessed and otherwise not. So, yeah.
Would it only be dispatchable resources that are participating in the day ahead market?
So in the day ahead market, what would happen is, to the extent that the market supports economic bids from resources that are able to move and dispatch very quickly in different time frames, but the market also supports self-schedules and it's the concept of, it could be used by entities that just want to operate, but it's also used by some resources that maybe are not as dispatchable, but they're going to operate at a particular level and they're indicating that to the market. And so market ensure that I'm committed to operate at this level. And some are more flexible than others, but the market, the EDAM does not preclude participation from any one type of resource. Effectively, all resources would now, if they're going to be operational, would need to do so through the market. So all resources in effect would be participating now. It just, are they participating economically through economic bids and be able to respond to those economic signals? Or are they going to be self-scheduling and indicating to the market that they want to operate at particular limited levels, whether that's driven by contractual obligations or driven by physical characteristic limitations.
And so from a utilities perspective, who's participating in the day ahead market, when they do their day ahead dispatch planning, they would receive information from the EDAM, and they would put that into their ranking in terms of capacity and cost, and then they would decide their day ahead dispatch based on what resource is popping up in the day ahead market. Is that how it would work?
So the market would, so the entities, and this kind of gets into some of the features on the next slide, but each utility would have to, each balancing area would have to demonstrate day ahead resource sufficiency, that you have enough resources to meet your next day expected obligations, which includes load forecast, ancillary, your load forecast conditions, your ancillary services, as well as a level of uncertainty depending on your load level uncertainty or variable energy resource uncertainty, because you may expect to operate these variable resources in one way in day ahead, but things may change, weather conditions may change, and so that's uncertainty. But each utility, each balancing area would have to demonstrate sufficiency, and the way that they demonstrate that is by submitting offers into the market, self-schedules, economic bids, and then the market would optimally dispatch or commit those resources in the day ahead time frame to meet those conditions, those expected next day conditions. So what the balancing area would need to do, and some balancing areas are all kind of differently situated, they may have more or less utilities within them, but the balancing area would need to coordinate with the utilities in its balancing area to ensure that enough bids are submitted and offers are submitted into the market to demonstrate sufficiency in the day ahead time frame. And then the market would economically commit and most efficiently commit resources across the footprint to meet those needs within that balancing area, outside of the balancing area to meet the broader footprint needs.
So let's assume the utility, there's one utility and it's operating the balancing area. So in effect, it would not be doing its own day ahead dispatch. It would be giving information about its resources to the EDAM, and the EDAM would be telling it how to dispatch its resources.
That's right. They would submit, it's more than just giving information. They each can decide, they're submitting the bids into the market. So they can economically bid resources at different levels. They can self-schedule other resources, but they would submit those bids into the market, and then the market would so decide.
It would be the utility's choice. Do we want to submit bids for all of our
right.
resources and get told how we should dispatch? Or do we want to say these are must run and
That's
we're
exactly
gonna submit to the EDAM
That's
these
exactly,
resources?
that's exactly right. And, you know, without getting further into some of the weeds, but the utility also, you know, they have to demonstrate their resource sufficiency. They may have excess supply beyond that on certain periods. Where they can also, there's an incentive to economically bid those resources or they can elect that, you know, I'm expecting some stress system conditions, so I'm not going to bid in these resources. I want to see how things are playing out from a reliability perspective, and I may, you know, then choose to dispatch, you know, offer into real time this resource. But it is their choice how they bid those resources, and you know, do they self-schedule certain of them that are, as you said, must run base resources, and then economically bid the rest.
I would note that, and maybe it's getting to your question, that over time, utilities are getting sort of smarter about what they're seeing in the market, right? So on day one of EDAM, they're going to be, you know, sort of doing exactly what they think they need to do,
Conservative.
but then they're going to learn a little bit about what other resources are out there in the market on a spring day or, you know, on a hot day. And so I think they will learn sort of like AI. They're going to get smarter and smarter every input that they receive. So that will every time make their day ahead bids even that much smarter.
And that's been the key theme of the overall EDAM design, is recognizing that utilities and entities that are participating will need some time to accustom themselves and to the operation of the market. And so there's a number of features where we've said, you know, let's those are optional to introduce, like the concept of convergence bidding, and that certain other features we're going to evaluate within 1 or 2 years to see, to allow entities to gain that experience with the market. So, and then there's a number of things where we're going to be monitoring how things are playing out in the market and be able to rapidly adjust depending on the conditions. But it's this key theme of leveraging as much of the design that's translatable from the EIM to the EDAM that entities are familiar with, and then as well recognizing the need to gain experience in the market before you introduce some more complex features, and a lot of monitoring, especially early on as entities get their foothold and gain that experience.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So in terms of the level of participation, so I'm assuming this is similar to the EIM where the balancing authority areas are submitting base schedules. Are they committing to submit a certain amount? Like, do they have to, you know, participate fully, or can they choose their level of participation for it?
Yeah, and so with the EDAM, the concept of base scheduling goes away. Now, all the load is in the market, and all the resources in one way or another are participating in the market.
Okay.
Whether that's through economic bidding, or as I was mentioning, you can self-schedule those that it's an indication to the market, I need to run, I'm a price taker. And so each utility is going to have to determine then how they're participating, but to the extent that they want some resources that have to run, or must run, or contractually obligated to run, those you would expect are self-scheduled. It could be economically bid, but the entities ultimately decide how much of that they economically bid or self-schedule. Ultimately, they have an obligation to demonstrate that you can meet your day ahead resource sufficiency. So today in the EIM, there's the EIM real-time sufficiency, where you have to demonstrate that you have enough resources to meet your obligations and your conditions for the next hour. In the day ahead now, you have a day ahead sufficiency evaluation where it ensures that you have enough resources that you can offer into the market that are contracted or otherwise, that you can make available to the market to meet your next day expected obligations. And then the market is going to efficiently commit those to meet the next day obligation. So there's not, you know, all the load is in and all the resources find their way in. If they're going to be operational, the market needs to know about them. It just, you have the flexibility now in how you economically bid them or how you self-schedule them. And there's mechanisms again to ensure that you can continue to exercise. I think we're getting maybe into the next slide 9, but you know, if resources have transmission rights that they want to exercise. There's the ability for the market to recognize that as well. So you self-schedule your resource, you tell the market, I have to run at 100 megawatts and I want to use my transmission rights to do that as well. And that provides certain settlement benefits as well. But then you can also just self-schedule those resources or economically bid them without the exercise of your rights, and the market is going to optimize those rights to support transfers between areas.
Okay, thank you. That helps. And then I have another question about just price signals for transmission, because in a full RTO or ISO, you have congestion and TRs, FTRs and CRRs.
Yeah.
Okay, so is there any benefit there from the EDAM to be able to generate price signals for where there is congestion and where more transmission is needed?
Yeah. So I'll talk about just briefly how transmission is made available, but there's the concept of the transmission customer can exercise their transmission rights that they have and receive a certain congestion hedge in the market, but they can also make transmission available to the market in advance of the day-ahead time frame if they're not expecting to need to utilize their rights, or they're not going to use them to support, for example, an import from another area to demonstrate resource efficiency. If those are excess transmission rights for a day, they can make those available to the market for the market to optimize, and they would receive what's called transfer revenue or similar concept of congestion revenue. To the extent that there are constraints that do materialize and congestion price goes up, they would be able to receive that congestion revenue associated with that transmission being made available to the market. So we have those mechanisms that to the extent that there are constraints either on the transfers between two EDAM areas on the transmission paths or within an EDAM area, that the congestion revenue can accrue and be settled with the EDAM entity, or the transfer revenue can accrue and settle with the EDAM entity. And then the EDAM entity, similar to the EIM today, ultimately would through its tariff determine how is that allocated within, if it has multiple entities, multiple transmission customers, multiple utilities, but they would accrue if there's congestion materializing on the system or transfer points between two EDAM areas because of the transmission that's been made available. That transfer and congestion revenue accrues and is settled with the EDAM entity. Separately, if you were asking on this front as well, the use of transmission, both in the EDAM and the EIM, doesn't necessarily drive transmission upgrades, but it can inform, to the extent there's congestion in some areas showing up more frequently than others, that can also help inform, can be an input into the transmission provider's considerations of where to build, where do they see the most utilization by the market, and that's an input. It's not necessarily a driver that we've experienced. I think in an RTO, as the transmission function is now planning across the wider footprint, I think that would be an important consideration in informing some of the more broader upgrades. But since each entity retains their transmission function and planning function, I think this is one of the many inputs that they may potentially use in informing where do they want to build or expand the system.
So this has been fantastic. I just wanted to do a time check.
Yeah.
We're halfway through the time. We're about a third the way through the slide. So if you have something super.
No, it's good.
I'll just note maybe the next
I've
section.
learned when I work with lawyers, they put the most important thing on the last page. So if you've done that, let's go there. But if not, just proceed at the pace that works the best for you.
Yeah, we can go to the next slide. I'll just close out on EDAM, just give you a sense of some of the milestones that are coming up. And that's slide 10. But in February, our ISO Board of Governors and the EM governing body jointly approved the design for the EDAM. And so where we are is in the tariff development stage, and we're working through a stakeholder process on translating design into the tariff that would ultimately be filed with FERC. And that's going to be going on for the next several months, where we ultimately expect to file with FERC the design and the tariff at the end of June of this year. And then in the meantime, you know, as you may know, Pacific already indicated their intent to join the EDAM, and so we're working on implementation activities ourselves internally to be able to develop the necessary systems to support EDAM, but we're also working with Pacific on their needs. And there may be other entities as we get a bit closer that indicate intent as well. But ultimately, we're expecting a spring 2025 onboarding with the interested entities. As we get closer, we'll get a sense of readiness of both the ISO and those entities, but at least that's the target at this point, where we would have the necessary systems, functionality, tariff, and those other entities as well would have gone through the necessary approval processes to begin that onboarding in spring of 2025.
Sorry to ask another question here, but in terms of the footprint, let's say Pacific Core is signing up, let's say just theoretically P&M signs up, would you need to have sort of contiguous transmission in order to make it work? You'd have to have, you couldn't have agreements with utilities that are not somehow connected. Is that?
Yeah, I mean, that's by and large, that's true. You're looking for that transmission connectivity. I'm not too familiar with the transmission rights P&M may have, but you know, let's just say in that hypothetical case, to the extent P&M is in, but some of the other connecting systems, you would look at what kind of transmission rights does P&M have across those adjoining systems, because they may have and likely do. Some entities have the long-term or short-term firm transmission rights across different systems, and those will be optimizable to support EDAM transfers and commitments in the day-ahead time frame. So while you may not necessarily have a contiguous footprint, you know, we've seen that with the EIM as well at the beginning with Pacific were joining. They had some transmission rights. You know, their balancing areas a bit scattered across different areas of the footprint, but we were able to leverage transmission rights that they had across BPA systems to support EIM transactions. So, you know, to the extent that there's a non-contiguous footprint, there's still the ability to support some transfers based on transmission rights that those entities may have across adjoining systems.
And I would add a lesser benefit, but even if there were limited transfers, engaging in the day-ahead market could optimize even better the balancing authority of P&M as it exists today, or any utility. So there's still benefits there, but the transfers really are where that's their long-term benefits sits. Okay. Okay, so we'll skip over the okay, we'll maybe come back to that when we talk about that. Okay, so I'm gonna have Holly come up and talk about our stakeholder process.
All right, thank you. So we're going to shift gears here just a little bit, but with regard to both the WEIM, and when I say WEIM, I mean the EIM, Western Energy Imbalance Market. But with respect to both the WEIM and EDAM, stakeholders have really played a key role in developing and refining those markets and to evolving market governance to reflect new developments. So we're, yeah. Oh yeah, can we go to the next slide, please? Let's advance 2 slides.
Slide 14,
Oh,
I think.
sorry. Keep going. Yes, slide 14 will get us. So thank you, Stacy. So here we're going to go through a few slides on the ISO stakeholder process and on market governance. So I'll just note that the ISO has a really robust and inclusive process for stakeholder engagement that includes working groups, technical workshops, draft proposals, opportunities for comment. So stakeholders are really directly engaged both throughout the proposal development and beyond proposal development. And with respect to EDAM, I'll just note that working groups were really key to the development of that market design from the very beginning. And those working groups are very inclusive. They provide equal access to all stakeholders. Everybody is welcome to participate in that process, to convey feedback, be part of the design from the bottom up. And Stakeholders continue now to be engaged in the tariff development. We're running some workshops on tariff development now, engaging stakeholders there as well. And they'll continue to have an opportunity to participate as this is filed with FERC. They'll have an opportunity, of course, to intervene, to submit comments once we file with FERC. And then their engagement will continue into the implementation phase. So really, stakeholders are key participants throughout the whole process. But let me take us back to the middle of this slide, to the decision-making phase. In the next slide, we'll look closer at the ISO board and the WEAM governing body, their decision-making process, and the groups that inform their decisions. So if we could go to the next slide. Slide 15, please. Excellent, thank you. So let me draw your attention to the orange star and the boxes just below that. So the ISO board and the WEIM governing body, they have shared authority over rules that apply to the WEIM. And I'll note also that just in February, the governing body and the ISO board approved a proposal to extend that joint decision-making authority to the EDAM as well. So with EDAM, joint authority there as well. So I'll give you a little background on these two bodies. The ISO board, it's comprised of 5 independent directors, and those directors are appointed by the governor. And the WEIM governing body, also comprised of 5 independent members. Those members, though, are selected by a nominating committee of regional stakeholders. Those nominees are confirmed by the governing body. So the board does not have a role in selecting the members of the WEIM governing body. And the governing body really was designed by regional stakeholders and then created by the board to facilitate the WEIM. And the governing body is charged with promoting the success of the market and also ensuring that the interests of all market participants from all across the footprint are represented here. So topics within this shared decision-making approval authority, those topics are presented to both bodies, both the ISO board and the WEIM governing body, in a joint session where the two bodies come together to hear about these topics collectively. And that really allows the members of both bodies to hear and participate in a full discussion of that topic, and ensures that the decisions that are made by these two bodies really transparently consider and balance the interests of all of the market customers. So approving a proposal, that requires approval by a majority of both of these bodies. So both a majority of the WEIM governing body and a majority of the board is required in order to move a proposal forward to FERC, to file with FERC. So beyond that, there's a lot of input that goes into informing the decision-making processes of these two bodies. The governance structure, of course, includes a body of state regulators, and that includes one commissioner from each state with a regulated entity that's participating in the WEIM. So that now includes 11 states, and of course, Commissioner Aguilera is the New Mexico representative to the BOSSER. This governance structure also includes a regional issues forum, and that provides an opportunity for a broader group of stakeholders to provide input from various sectors, and it represents interest from all across the Western interconnection. So going down to the next box, from the next row of boxes from there, the board and governing body decisions, they're also informed by the Department of Market Monitoring, the Market Surveillance Committee, and there's also an independent market expert that provides an independent advice directly to the governing body. So it bringing an independent opinion, an independent view to inform the governing body's decision-making process. So I'll just say that the board and the governing body, they really do give very close consideration to these input streams. And I'll just say specifically that they greatly value the feedback they've received from the body of state regulators, that has been extremely important to their decision-making processes. So if we could move to slide 16, please. Thank you. This slide just provides a little bit more information on the Regional Issues Forum and the body of state regulators. So the Regional Issues Forum, again, represents a really broad group of stakeholders from across the Western Interconnection, and it provides a forum for discussion of WEIM-related items. It's led by 10 sector liaisons and they work to facilitate engagement and collect feedback from their various sectors. So we have sector liaisons representing WEIM entities, transmission operators, public interest organizations, consumer advocates, IPPs, etc. So stakeholders from across various sectors. And then the body of state regulators, of course, these are the leaders of state engagement on the WEIM and related initiatives. And I think the BOSSER serves as a really important resource to the states, and also serves as an important advisor to the governing body. If we could move to the next slide, please. So this slide really just captures the leadership of the body of state regulators, the governing body, and the Regional Issues Forum. Again, representing New Mexico, Commissioner Aguilera here. The governing body, this group represents a really wide scope of expertise and regional experience. We have members from all across the West, bringing various talents and experience to decision-making and the dialogue here. And then the Regional Issues Forum, this chart just highlights the chair and vice chair, but Regional Issues Forum meetings, they're open to the public and open for BOSSER participation as well. And next slide, please. So thank you. And we can go ahead to the next slide. Before I turn things back over to Milos, I'll just provide a few updates on California legislative efforts as they relate to expanded regional collaboration. And starting with Assembly Concurrent Resolution 188. In 2022, the California legislature approved Assembly Concurrent Resolution 188 and asked the ISO to assemble and summarize existing studies on regional collaboration. No new studies, but looking at what studies have been done on regional collaboration in the past and bringing together a summary of that. So in response to that, we did work with California Balancing Authority areas and also contracted with the National Renewable Energy Lab as an independent consultant to author that report. And we worked with stakeholders to review the list of studies that would be considered in that report, and also to review a draft of that report, gather feedback on that before we delivered a final report to the legislature in late February. And among other efforts, this report notes the state-led market study. It does note the Western Power Pool's Western Resource Adequacy Program. It does note Southwest Power Pool's market efforts. So a really broad swath of considerations, studies, regional efforts, etc. And I won't read through these findings that are right in front of you, but just highlight that governance really did emerge as an important issue, and just also that as states adopt new policy goals and invest in new resources, that we can better and more effectively achieve our policy objectives if we collaborate with one another across the region. So next slide, please. I just have one more before we turn things. I'll take your questions and we can turn to Milos again. Okay, so Assembly Bill 538, this was introduced by Assembly Member Holden, who is the chair of the Appropriations Committee. And it really envisions an effort to work with states all across the West to expand the regional electricity footprint for cleaner energy resources, and also to enable better collaboration, transparency, and integration across the transmission system. So that is set for hearing by the Utilities and Energy Committee on April 26th. And if it proceeds and then passes the Senate, this will go to the California Energy Commission for review for public process, and they'll work in collaboration with the CPUC and also the California Air Resources Board. But of course, this would require broad stakeholder engagement, a lot of stakeholder engagement across the West. But in the meantime, we're really encouraged to see this dialogue on opportunities to bring more affordable and reliable energy to customers. And in our role, we are standing by as a technical resource to the legislature and stakeholders. So I'll take any questions that you might have, and then we can turn to Milos for some exciting news on resource adequacy and transmission.
Thank you, Holly. I don't have any questions.
Okay, all right.
All right, thank you, Holly. And I think we'll talk a little bit about resource adequacy now. I think this is where some of your initial questions were going towards, and what are we doing in California regarding resource adequacy, our role and function as a balancing area. And I do want to touch and recognize the evolving resource adequacy structure in the West as well. But if we're on slide 22. Yeah, there we go. Just want to recognize that the ISO shares, it has a shared responsibility with a number of agencies, including the California Energy Commission and the Public Utilities Commission, in operating and implementing elements of the forward resource adequacy program. This is in our function as our balancing area, that we do this coordination with the other agencies. But as I think Stacy alluded to at the beginning, when you had some of these questions, the CEC, the California Energy Commission, they have the role of working with the different utilities and establishing the load forecasts for those utilities, working together with them. And those load forecasts ultimately inform the level of resource adequacy procurement for each entity. Then the CPUC, the Public Utilities Commission, they manage the resource adequacy requirements for their jurisdictional utilities. And if you're familiar with California, that's primarily the investor-owned utilities, PG&E, Southern California Edison, San Diego Gas and Electric, as well as some of the CECs, not the CECs, what are they called? The CCAs, yeah, community choice aggregators. And then the ISO, we established the resource adequacy tariff, and we administer those resource adequacy requirements. We provide default resource adequacy requirements, as well as we administer a backstop process. What happens to the extent that there is not enough resource adequacy supply that's been procured? The ISO, under its tariff, we have the authority to make additional procurement and then allocate those costs to the utilities in the balancing area. But if we can go to the next slide, just to give you a sense, and we touched a little bit on this earlier, but on slide 23, just to talk a little bit about the supporting that daily and hourly sufficiency within the state. I think the integrated resource planning process is key, and then how that translates to resource adequacy. But the IRP, this is a CPUC administered long-term planning and procurement process that ensures, and this is in consultation with a number of entities, including the load serving entities, as well as the ISO, but it tries to ensure that there is a plan, a long-term plan, a 10-year forward resource plan that looks to position the state to meet its decarbonization goals, as well as other goals, but doing so in a reliable and a cost-effective way. And so we provide input on reliability needs, what are we seeing on the grid? And what's the IRP also informs the resource mix that's needed on the grid to meet those decarbonization goals. And we provide input from a reliability perspective as well, in particular, since we manage reliability on a day-to-day basis. And so a key to that transition is obviously having renewable resources, flexible resources, but primarily those flexible resources. And I'll talk about a couple of slides from now, graphs of what kind of resources we're seeing, but storage is a big part of that story. Energy storage resources that can capture in the middle of the day that renewable generation and then be able to dispatch and be able to meet some of those ramping needs when solar was ramping down. But this IRP provides that roadmap then that the load serving entities, the jurisdictional utilities utilize to facilitate procurement. And the CPUC may mandate that some of those that they may mandate procurement targets that are based on the IRP at different levels across that 10-year horizon. But that IRP then informs that annual resource adequacy and monthly resource adequacy process that each load serving entity contracts bilaterally for resources to meet their annual and monthly resource adequacy requirements. As I noted earlier, the CEC, the California Energy Commission, they create load forecasts that inform the level of resource adequacy procurement for each utility on an annual basis. And those resource adequacy then bilateral arrangements and those annual showings are informed by the IRP, that long-term 10-year plan. But the utilities then, when they contract for that supply to meet their annual and monthly resource adequacy obligations, the ISO tariff provides for the requirement that those resources then have to be offered into the market. They have what's called a must-offer obligation. And what that does, that ensures then that the market on a day-to-day, hour-to-hour basis has sufficient resources to be able to meet its expected obligations, and then the market optimizes that. This is how we in the EIM, as an EIM participant, as a EDAM participant in the future, this is how we effectively meet our resource sufficiency on a daily basis. And those resource, that supply that's under contract is offered into the market, and then we optimize it along with all the other resources that are made available. If we can go just to the next slide, slide 24, just to give you a sense of the evolving procurement to ensure reliability. But the CPUC has directed over the years and looking forward as well, a sizable amount of generation procurement by its jurisdictional utilities. For example, over 18,000 megawatts of new capacity that they have to procure and bring on from 2021 to 2028. And we've seen, since 2020, we've seen a sizable amount, upwards of 14,000 megawatts of new generation be integrated onto the grid, ranging from co-located storage resources with more solar and renewable resources, as with new other solar and wind and renewable generation that we'll see on the next slide. But the CPUC directs that procurement to the utilities, that they bring the supply to the table across a particular time frame, that they contract for it, and that shows up then in those resource adequacy plans that they submit to us on an annual and a monthly basis. And the CPUC is consistently evaluating how much generation needs to be brought onto the table to meet reliability and state goals. And more recently, in February, they directed additional procurement of 4,000 megawatts of new resources by 2028. And there's an expectation that there's a need for 86,000 megawatts or 86 gigawatts of new resources that are needed by 2035 to help the state achieve some of its decarbonization goals. And like I said, again, that's going to be translated to these annual resource adequacy plans. And you would expect that as loads grow and as the utilities meet their mandates, that this renewable resources, as well combined with storage, does end up showing up in those annual and monthly plans, and then is bid into the market. If we can go to slide 25, just do a couple of illustrations on the next two slides to give you a sense of what we're seeing in terms of build out to meet those decarbonization goals in the near term. But we've seen a significant increase in solar resources, as you can expect, over the last few years, and that's expected to grow into 2030, effectively more than doubling what we have online today by 2030, as well as growth in wind generation. And on the next slide, I'll show you, if we can go to slide 26, but we're also expecting a significant build out of storage generation to help meet those clean energy goals. And storage is key because again, it provides that flexibility to be able to charge that storage in the middle of the day with excess renewable generation, but then also have that flexible dispatchability in the peak, in the late afternoon and evening hours when solar generation is ramping down. Those storage resources can provide that flexibility and discharge to be able to meet those evening peaks. And what we're expecting, as you can expect with increase in renewable resources, particularly solar on the grid, storage becomes even more important. And so we're expecting a significant increase in the need for storage capacity. We've seen just anecdotally in 2020, we had about 400 megawatts of storage generation in the ISO balancing area. That's expected to grow to 6,500 this year. We've seen an exponential growth in storage generation, a lot of it co-located with solar resources and other renewable generation on the grid. But we're expecting that the state is going to need additional storage capacity. Today, what we have is primarily you're seeing 4-hour storage resources, and that has certain limitations, particularly during heavy or long prolonged weather events. And so there's also a need and a concentration on longer duration storage to be able to achieve some of these goals. But nevertheless, significant build out of storage is expected and needed to be able to achieve our goals and integrate the renewables that are expected on the grid to be able to meet that decarbonization state policy.
Do you have a chart that reflects the duration of the storage?
I don't have that chart, but we do know that a number of resources that are currently in the interconnection process, and we've indicated this as well through our various processes and in the IRP as well, the need for additional longer term storage. The vast majority of the storage that we have currently on the grid is 4-hour duration, but we're expecting that with improvements in technology and some of the other resources that are in the interconnection process, I think ideally we would look for something that's closer to 8-hour duration storage, if not more. And then if we can go just to the final slide here on resource adequacy, slide 20, there we go, slide 27. I do want to just acknowledge that resource adequacy is evolving in the West, and the landscape is evolving to help us all meet, those be sufficient and meet some of the resource shortfall challenges that I think the West has been experiencing over the last several years. And we're very supportive of the growth and new resource adequacy programs that are developing in the West, including the Western Resource Adequacy Program that's been recently approved by FERC, and they're certainly working on refining some of their requirements. But similarly, the California RA program is evolving as well. And what we're ultimately looking for is harmonization between these programs, and looking at comparability and translatability and requirements between these, I think, is going to be key on a going forward basis. And we are in the process of working very closely with the Western Power Pool that's administering the Western RA program in evaluating that level of comparability and the need for evolution in the programs. But we feel confident that there's a high degree of comparability in these programs at this point in time. And we've done a number of things in California as well to evolve our program since 2020. For example, we've increased the planning reserve margin. That's the margin that effectively that deals with uncertainty, different types of uncertainty, but that's increased from 15% to roughly 17% in next year in 2024. I think it's increasing gradually, but that's going to bring that imposes additional obligations on the utilities to increase their procurement of resource adequacy supply to be able to manage those changes in conditions. And we've also, as I noted on the previous slides, we've seen a significant increase in the integration of resources on our grid since 2020, particularly storage. And that as well is going to help ensure sufficiency of California and the ISO in particular, if we get into similar events such as the 2020 events, as well as the heat wave that we experienced last year, and be able to better respond to those conditions. But ultimately, we are striving for harmonization between the programs in the West, and that harmonization, I think, is going to be important for the interoperability and continued growth of markets around the West. So let me pause there on resource adequacy. Next is transmission planning, just to kind of paint the picture of how this IRP program feeds into our transmission planning processes. But anything on resource adequacy? Okay. If not, we can go then to let's just jump to slide 29. So, another important function that we perform and that we touched on early on is that the ISO performs the transmission planning and operation function across its balancing area. And so we publish an annual transmission plan. We work very closely with, again, also the CPC, the CEC, and the participating transmission owners within California on these plans to identify and really try to proactively and strategically get ahead of some of the needs and be able to integrate the resources that we need to meet our decarbonization goals. And so most recently, through the transmission plan that was published earlier this month, we've identified a new and proactive and strategic way of planning to bring on the necessary resources in time to meet the different state decarbonization goals. And the transmission planning process is key to that. We talked about earlier on the previous slides on the function of the CPUC and developing that IRP, that integrated resource plan that looks out 10 years on a long-term horizon. And that plan really identifies the resources, the resource mix that's needed to meet the decarbonization goals. And that plan that we work very closely with the CPUC to translate that into the transmission planning process and inform the transmission planning process so that we can proactively identify, one, what are those areas on the system where there's space to interconnect, but also what are those areas on the system where we would want, where we can do additional build outs, those zones on the grid where we can incentivize resource development there. And so the transmission plan, what it did is it identified those zones where we either have transmission space to interconnect resources or where we're planning significant transmission upgrades over the coming years to be able to integrate that additional generation onto the system. And by identifying that through the transmission plan, it provides signals to the load serving entities where to focus their procurement over the next coming 10 years or so. And that translates into the resource adequacy plans. But it also, what we've indicated is through the interconnection process, we're providing incentives for entities to interconnect and bring generation into those transmission planning zones by providing effectively prioritization in the interconnection process to resources that go to those zones as opposed to going to other more congested areas. But if you can interconnect and develop your resources in those interconnection zones, we can more readily facilitate and proceed and speed up the interconnection process than if you were trying to interconnect into a different area where there may be significant facility upgrades that are needed. That takes time, where there may be significant permitting needed, land use issues. But these zones really provide us a way to quickly integrate or more rapidly integrate resources than you otherwise would without providing that information publicly, where entities are just going to areas that provide more challenges in interconnecting those resources in a timely manner. If they go into those zones, then we provide a prioritization in our process to interconnections in those zones to be able to get the resources online faster than otherwise would be possible. And so that cycle and that proactive coordination with the CPUC and the transmission planning process being actively informed by that resource planning process, and then providing the necessary signals and incentives to developers, we think is going to allow us to more rapidly bring the necessary supply online to meet those decarbonization goals. If we go on to just the next slide, slide 30, but just to give you a sense of, this is similar to some of the other graphics, but to give you a sense of the state agency resource plans that are provided to the ISO for planning, they look 10, 20 years out. And I think the story is fairly similar. Additional solar resources, when you look beyond just the 10-year period and you're now looking to 2040, significant increase in solar resources, wind generation, as well as battery storage is going to be key to facilitating that integration. And these are the plans that then inform our transmission planning process and ultimately develop these transmission plans on an annual basis. Once we identify in the most recent plan, we've identified a number of significant transmission upgrades in these zones to be able to integrate resources internally, but also to be able to support the integration of imports and other transmission projects that are going on around the West that are able to bring clean resources onto the grid. And we think that this more proactive and strategic way of looking at transmission planning is really going to help us meet our goals and allow for some of the resources that are coming online to be able to interconnect fairly quickly than if they were operating on their own and just going to different areas of the system where there may be certain limitations to the integration of those resources. If we go just one more slide, it's just the indication of the different zones across the state where we're integrating additional projects or we're planning additional transmission upgrades. Some are smaller, some are larger, 230, 500 kV transmission upgrades, and then zones where we're also bolstering the interconnection facilities to be able to integrate additional wind from out of state to meet our goals. Sure. Yeah, we use different sensitivities within and base case assumptions within the transmission planning studies that look at different levels of generation that have been integrated or that we're expecting to integrate onto the grid. And those studies then identify what's the level of transmission upgrades that may be needed in different areas. But we have base case studies and we run different sensitivities with different level of imports that may be coming onto the grid and what effect does that have on transmission upgrades and different levels of internal generation, as well as the retirement of certain resources on our grid and what impact does that have on the on additional resource needs, and where would we need transmission upgrades to continue to reliably operate local zones on the grid and integrate additional resources to make up for the retirement of certain more emitting resources over time.
Yes, I'm just trying to get a little bit of context here. So like comparing these last two slides together, if you go back to slide 30 on the bar charts, can you kind of, you know, how many megawatts we're talking about in this 20-year outlook for wind out of state?
I don't think I have that number close. We can get back to you, I think, on that number, but there are certain assumptions about bringing in additional out-of-state wind that we've been working with our stakeholders as well, and the CPUC, where there are a number of contracts that external entities are expecting and are in the process of executing with resources outside of our balancing area, and being able to bring that out of state wind will be an important piece to the puzzle. So we can come back and identify the exact megawatts of out of state.
Yeah, just using the calibrated eyeball, it looks like 10,000 units of whatever the units are on the left-hand side.
Yeah. Yeah, there you go.
And then megawatts or megawatt hour.
5,000 megawatts capacity, right?
And you're saying 5 from southern and 5 from northern. And southern's really just New Mexico.
That's right.
That's a lot.
It's a lot.
And then slide 31, do you have a list of, you know, there's this ominous additional transmission required in the map and on the left-hand side. is that transmission for everything coming in from out of state, or do you have a sense of what are there specific projects included in that concept, or is it projects that have yet to be identified?
I think, I think we can come back with those as well, but I think a number of them are based on existing transmission projects that are underway across multiple balancing areas that would, for example, I think Boardman to Hemingway is one of those projects that's expected to bring Wyoming wind into California. And then there's other projects that with transmission developers that are actively working on across different systems to be able to facilitate bringing in that wind across the different systems. But I think we can identify those names of the projects.
I mean, what I'm thinking is, SunZia.
Yes, yeah,
But then there's the sister project to SunZia, and there's another line whose name escapes me at the moment in southern New Mexico, South Line,
Yeah, I think SunZia is certainly one of them, and we can double check on some of those other projects.
It'd just be helpful to try to add up what those projects unlock versus this 5,000 megawatts, just to get an idea of how much more we're talking about.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, thank you we got to the end of the slides, which maybe that's an accomplishment, maybe not, but commissioners, do you have any other questions? And if you don't, I think we've got some time, we can open it up to other.
I might ask just a couple more questions with the I guess thinking about the day ahead market, the EDAM, obviously many Western states have renewable portfolio standards. When dispatch is done with the EDAM, and let's say renewable energy is part of that, what happens to those RECs, those renewable energy certificates? Do they follow the power, or do they remain with the utility that owns the resource?
Yeah, I think it may vary depending upon the nature of the different state program. But we, through the market, to the extent that the market does dispatch resources, and we do this in the EIM today. Resources, for example, I'll just use the example of California, where we have a carbon price on resources through our GHG program. Entities from out of state that have generation, they can identify whether they want that resource to be considered for dispatch in a greenhouse gas regulation area, and if so, they then include an adder that represents the cost of compliance with that program. But afterwards, we provide data to each one of the entities as to what resources were dispatched, how they were dispatched, and we're hoping that they're utilizing, depending on their program, that they can utilize that data to inform compliance with their own state program. So, for example, California, our entities, we provide information to our own utilities as to how much generation from out of state was dispatched to serve internal load, and that facilitates some compliance with programs, as well as we share that data with the California Air Resources Board, who administers that program, and they're tracking the impacts of imports on their regulations and their ability to meet reduction goals.
Yeah, I would just add that this is Stacy Crowley again, the RPS compliance is really left to the utilities that have that obligation. So in terms of our market, we sort of let them know what's been dispatched, but it's really up to them. And I think it stays with the contractual obligation of that resource. So if it's a 100 megawatt solar plant, the owner of that plant would take those RECs. I think they can trade RECs, but it's up to them to complete.
And I guess one question on the governance issue, the AB 538, does that impact the EDAM rollout in any way?
No, it's not intended to. This would be, if passed, the statute would be associated with a RTO, Regional Transmission Organization Development Evolution. So the governance that has been established for EDAM still complies with state statute, but it's not, it doesn't need to change state statute to be able to be implemented. And we plan on implementing the sort of expanded authority of the Energy Imbalance Market Governing Body that Holly talked about when we get FERC approval on the EDAM market design. So that's sort of the trigger for implementing the EDAM governance changes. And they're not associated with the bill. And we plan to continue to push forward with EDAM, get that stood up under the kind of joint authority model that Holly described. Meanwhile, we'll be having sort of parallel discussions on whether or not the state of California allows us to have a fully independent board for an RTO.
I see. So for the EIM and the EDAM, you have or will have fully independent boards that are not nominated by the governor of California. The question really is only on the RTO side.
Right, for EIM and EDAM, we'll have the sort of the two boards, the board that's appointed by the California governor and the shared authority with a fully independent board that will share authority on EIM and EDAM decisions. So that can stay under our current statutory requirements. If we want to go further to explore RTO, we do need to repeal the statute in California law that appoints our fiduciary board by the governor and confirmation by the Senate. So that repeal of statute is important for other states and other state utilities to see before they can think about participating in RTO that we manage.
Thank you.
Do you have a go live prediction on EDAM?
Spring 2025. Pacific Corp has indicated in their intent to participate. We're assuming and hoping others will do that as well. And we could see a number of utilities joining in spring of 2025. There'll be some implementation activities in 2024. That's mostly software upgrades and things that we need to be ready to kind of, welcome them in. But the kind of switch would be 2025 spring.
And then I don't know, this might be a wrong audience for this question, but just a integrated resource planning paradigm. And I think it's a hangover from the merchant generation days was don't have anything more than the minimum of what you need to supply your load. So one of the things I'm just trying to imagine here is, does something like EDAM or RTO for our state change that paradigm? Because I mean, what I'm seeing here is we've got a huge contribution to make just to California's clean energy goals. And I know California is not alone in the West in having those goals. So does this reduce the risk for utilities going long on supply, especially wind supply, because then there is a place to sell it that would benefit New Mexico ratepayers? Is that a flip of a resource planning paradigm as we move forward with these kind of markets? So don't know if you have any thoughts on that, or just am I just talking out loud?
No, I think there'll be more efficiency altogether, and ideally, the energy that gets produced, the resources that get built are going to be better utilized across the broader footprint. So yes, so those who contract to build it would benefit from having it in the market, especially as you said, more states go to the variable energy resource portfolios to meet their clean energy goals. I think you'll see that. And right now, natural gas has been an important component of the transition because it's been the thing that you can call on no matter what time of day. But that geographic diversity and the battery storage components will really, I think, help all the resources be more efficient in the market.
Thank you. Do you have any more questions?
Aside from the governance and, their discussions on greenhouse gas, calculations and all that, is there anything else that other state regulators have been asking you about or concerned about?
Certainly, I think you're right. The GHG, the resource adequacy piece, I think as well. And as Milo said, that we really are working closely with the Western Resource Adequacy Program to make sure that those are harmonized. But I think, starting to see that come to be will be important for other states. The transparency piece is also, I think, of interest to the states, because in a market, you really do see where resources are coming from and going to. Right now, we have this lump of we call imports that come in, and you do as well. And it's there's sort of a default emissions rate to that. Everything is sort of set at a default rate because you can't really see. So I think the transparency that a market provides really helps states, especially with ambitious climate goals and GHG components, see better what resources are actually being used to serve their customers. So that's another element. And I don't know if you have what you're hearing in terms of what's important to states.
No, I think those are the key ones. Continuing to evolve the GHG design to account for evolving state regulations, resource adequacy, harmonization, and transparency and governance. Yeah.
So we have 5 more minutes on our scheduled time. We have a few folks in the room. I just wanted to open it up to the room if you've got any questions. My lack of glasses, I can see that people have posted questions on the Zoom chat, but I can't see what that is. So, anyway, I'll start with the room if anybody's got any questions.
Just one quick question for Ed Roboff with staff. Ed, have a card.
Ed, we've got a microphone
To the mic over here.
Or we can give it a mic.
so YouTube can capture the brilliance of your question.
Oh, now I'm under the gun. Hi. Yeah, just a quick question on the carbon tax in California. Is you said it's mandatory in California, but not mandatory for resources outside. Is that correct?
Right. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, to the extent what the market does allow is that if somebody's wants a resource to serve load in California, they can indicate in the market if they want to be eligible for the market to dispatch them to serve load in California, in which case it adds a adder to the cost that reflects the cost of compliance with the California program.
So it's voluntary in that the resource, let's say it's a natural gas plant in Nevada, that they would have to add a portion or a price to comply with California regulations. So it's been saying, okay, I'm okay with adding that additional price to my resource in order to dispatch into California, but they will have to then sort of comply with the California cap and trade program.
Yeah, and then the market considers that additional adder in addition to their economic bid in determining the most efficient and cost-effective dispatch.
Okay. Where do the adder revenues? They go to the state then? Is that correct? Is that...
Yeah, I think they are settled with they go ultimately to the CARB and go into a fund that effectively
The
pays
compliance program, right? So it would go to the air resources boards through their compliance mechanism and help offset the carbon costs.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
I guess, Patrick, could you help us if there's a question on the chat in Zoom, if we could flip it to whoever asked that question, and if that's not a question, then I apologize.
Yes, Mr. Chair, we have a question from Richard Martinez. He asked, during an energy crisis, is there a priority list of which utility companies get resources first?
There you go.
Yeah, there's not a priority list in a stress system condition. The market is looking at dispatching resources based on the conditions on the grid, most economic system dispatch, but it doesn't necessarily prioritize. We do have concepts that we've recently introduced into the market that say that if our resource is failing its resource sufficiency evaluation in real time, that they can opt to have assistance energy from the rest of the footprint because they haven't met their obligations, they haven't contracted sufficient generation to meet their needs. There's an option to identify if they want assistance energy at a particular at a price from the rest of the footprint. Otherwise, the default approach is if an entity is not able to meet their sufficiency evaluation, then there are limited transfers that can go into that balancing area. And then that balancing area relies on its own operational tools that it may have at its disposal to manage reliability, whether that's emergency supply from other areas, whether that's emergency supply that may be available in its own area. But otherwise, the market, if all entities pass their resource sufficiency evaluation, the market does not in any way prioritize. It's just doing least cost dispatch across the footprint.
Right. That's right. And I think the question might be also stemming from the wheel through issue, but and even in that case, there's sort of equal priority over similar resources with similar transmission. So we're trying to make it sort of an equitable platform for which to move energy through our system. So folks can know what to expect when there are stress conditions. If there is a need to curtail through a particular transmission congested corridor, it would be curtailed pro rata if you have the similar priority status in terms of firm load with firm transmission. So there's some more details in there, but we do try to have a fair system.
Good answer. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, I think we're at time, and I know I very much appreciate you coming and been a very rich conversation here. So looking forward to hearing how BOSER evolves. And do you have any final questions or final thoughts?
No, nothing other than to say thank you for coming in today. It's been very interesting. Appreciate the exchange.
Yeah, thank you. I'll let you.
Yeah, just echo the thanks. This was informative and you did a very good job answering our questions. So thank you.
Well, we're here anytime you have questions, please have you or your staff feel free to reach out. We do offer training at any level. If you have specific training for you or your staff, we're happy to provide that. And I'm sure we'll see you at the next BOSER meeting or other regional events. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. We are adjourned.